Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ, again. We're talking about 1982 today. We've gone through enough episodes at this point where I think maybe we're starting to get a flavor for what's going on in the 80s, what we left back in the 70s, and perhaps starting to get a little bit of an idea of what the 90s is going to bring eventually, right? It's getting very exciting. For those that aren't familiar with what this podcast is all about, just giving you a little bit of a reminder, this is based upon a project that I've been doing over the last several years where I'm listening to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of albums every single year and keeping the ones that I like and I find to be impactful and important and meaningful for the year and also for the greater history of music, and kind of leaving by the wayside a lot of the albums that I didn't find to be necessarily nearly as impactful. And the reason that I'm doing this podcast is to walk through each year talking about what I perceive to be the music trends that are moving in and moving out over the course of this year, as well what's hot right now in this particular year. I walk through all of my essential albums for this year and why, and then also talk about some of the conspicuous absences that I'm leaving off of my essential list for this year and why. All of this music that I'm talking about, I have linked in the description for this episode so you can check them out. In particular, the big list of all the albums that I kept from, in this case, 1982, but also a little bit of a change up this year from the prior years, which is in the interest of me becoming more efficient and giving you all what it is you want and need and getting that feedback. I've decided that for my essentials list, I'm actually just going to link specific songs from particular albums that I'm going to be discussing here in today's episode. So you can go into that essential list, which is also linked in the episode description, to check out those songs. And if you have an interest to go check out the greater album, feel free to go to my bigger list, also linked in the description of this episode. So, we're going to talk a little bit about music trends for this year, what's moving in and out, and what's happening right now. We're going to talk about my essential albums, my conspicuous absences, and then close out. Sound good? Great. Let's get going. So, for music trends for this year, what's moving in? There's a lot moving in for this year. I think we've been talking the last couple of years about neo-traditionalist country. There's a huge long runway for this that doesn't, I think, peak until the early mid-90s. When we say neo-traditionalist country, we're talking, at least in the 90s, about Garth Brooks. We're talking about Clint Black, George Strait, things like that. And then in these earlier years, I kept some of those albums in my big list. I didn't reference any in my essential list, but it's continuing to steadily creep up. You can definitely start to see that there's a proliferation of these neo-traditionalist country records that are hitting. And eventually it will peak in the late 80s and early 90s. So it'll happen, and I may very well put one in my essential list eventually, but not quite yet. Next, twee pop. So this is a very specific offshoot of pop, which is actually one of my favorite versions of pop. It was ushered in by Tracy Thorn, who at this point in time was by herself, but she eventually got into Marine Girls and then Everything But the Girl. And then I think she's, as of today, back just doing her own thing by herself. I did keep her first album for 1982 for this year, and she is ushering in that sound. So we'll talk about that in greater depth when we get there. But twee pop. And when we talk about twee pop, I can describe it for you. You could also just go listen to the tracks, but it's very introspective. It kind of sounds like shoegaze a little bit, which is to say it's very quiet. It's very lo-fi. It sounds like playing in a very small room, in a very quiet room. It's like you're playing music in a library. It's very quiet. It's very introspective. It's a little bit introverted and very intimate. And it's some of my favorite pop for sure. Next, pop punk. It started about a year ago, right, with the Go-Go's, and it's continuing to proliferate further and expand out further. There's a lot more examples this year of pop punk starting to take shape and take form. So that's definitely on the way in. Rap, also on the way in. We had Curtis Blow previously. We had Two Bad DJs, kind of on the reggae side. We're going to keep moving in that direction. I think that we're still probably 2-3 years before rap really, really hits. So it's still on the way in, for sure. Alternative rock, it's really starting to take shape, I think, in many different ways. And there's a lot of tracks on albums in my essentials that help to show how alternative rock is evolving out of post-punk, is evolving out of new wave punk in a variety of different capacities, because I think alternative rock, much like punk or new wave, is a really broad definition and has a lot of different shapes to it. So we're going to try and do what we can to discuss all the different ways in which alternative rock is emerging as a trend and see if we can tease out why this alternative rock sound is evolving as it is. Next, post-disco contemporary R&B. I know that's like a big mouthful, but it's the best way to articulate what's happening around contemporary R&B in this moment, just because we've clearly evolved out of disco. Like, disco is gone, it's over. Even 3 years ago in 1979, when we were talking about it moving out, it was out, right? So at this point, disco is not only passé, it might actually be going in the ground and they're starting to throw dirt on it. Like, it's quite out. But what is evolving out of it, this contemporary idea of R&B that's happening in the early 80s, is happening. It's emerging. And then an offshoot of that is Quiet Storm. If you want to think about what is Quiet Storm, think of Whitney Houston, right? There were obviously precursors to Whitney Houston, because Whitney won't come along for several years. But we talked a little bit last year in 81 with Luther Vandross about Quiet Storm, this idea that you're singing really intensely, but very quietly, or with great control, but you're singing about intense things, or there just sounds like there's a lot of breath and intensity behind what you're singing. So all of that is still moving in. It's not quite on trend yet. And then finally, J-Rock. We talked last year about loudness. J-Rock is continuing to very slowly and steadily emerge as its own sound in Japan. Not quite there yet. I think probably give it another year or two and it'll be on trend. But having said that, what's on trend right now? City pop. City pop is very clearly on trend in Japan right now. I didn't keep any J-pop albums in my essentials for this year, but I believe next year there might be several examples. So city pop is on trend very clearly. It's at the beginning of being on trend, but it's on trend nonetheless. Next, soft rock. Since The Police, Zenyatta Mandata, we've come a long way since that moment, and soft rock is clearly taking shape because we've already gone through Hall & Oates, we've gone through Phil Collins, and we're going to keep going down that path, and it continues to take shape in its own right. So it hasn't exactly the full flat plateau of being on top and in trend, but it's nearly there for sure. New wave of heavy metal, still on trend. I would say maybe it's starting to get to the end of that flat plateau and it's starting to see the end of being on top. It's not quite there yet. I think there's still a little bit more juice to squeeze on that one, but it's definitely a lot further on the plateau than some of this other earlier stuff that's just getting going. And then even closer to the edge, post-punk. I think it's honestly on the cusp of moving out, which is very sad because post-punk has given us a lot of really great moments. But this is also kind of part of doing this project and this experience is you listen to this really great music, you fall in love with it, but then 10 seconds later, it's over. It's gone. And so because of that, you are having to invest, honor it, and then move on a little bit. But you can always go back and listen to these albums. It's not like they're dead, buried in the ground and you can't go back and listen to them ever again. But there's just something new that's coming along, and it's going to kind of push this out of the way. Specifically, alternative rock is pushing post-punk out of the way. So it's not quite moving out yet, but it's getting really close. And then what's getting even closer? New wave synth pop. The amount of experimentation for this is getting to a bargain basement level. Like, there's not a lot of innovation going on. There's not a lot of exciting experimentation. There's not a lot of vulnerability going on here. But there is a lot of people trying to capitalize on the sound while they still can. Also, we're starting to see some examples of people doing all the right things in it, as if to say we're almost sending it off. Right? You know, like Labor of Lust from 79 or Back in Black, AC/DC in 80. It's ushering out those sounds by saying this is the best example or version that you're going to get, or it's really, really up there. But there's not a lot of experimentation going on, which is sad because new wave synth pop has also been great. But again, we move forward, we move on. And then finally, what's actually moving out? Nothing. Nothing this year is necessarily moving out full bore. But like I said, I think that we have some stuff that's getting really close to the edge. Okay, let's talk about essential albums for this year and why. First, the bongos, drums along the Hudson. This is alternative rock. It's almost pop punk, but it's definitely not post-punk. And the reason I say this is because it's clear that the bongos are one of our great early examples, if you think back to episode 0, talking about the timeline of a trend, that they are adopting some 60s rock and roll elements in order to soften up the punk sound into this proto-alternative rock idea or even pop punk, which I think is ironic, right? Because the point of traditional punk originally was to resist the rock and roll sound of the 60s. So it's a little bit ironic that they're reincorporating some of those ideas into punk in order to soften it up and make it more consumable. It's just an interesting phenomenon. But it does hold true our idea that in 1982, we're talking about 20 to 25 years away from that sound. And that would be like 1960, 1962, right? So we're starting to see how those retro ideas start to reincorporate themselves into what is current and what is modern. You can listen to this and you can hear it exactly. And the examples I'll give you, which is on my Essentials playlist for this album, In the Congo, Glow in the Dark, those are two examples of them incorporating 60s rock and roll retro ideas into the music in order to soften it up. And then Video Eyes, it's pop punk. So we're continuing to go down that lane of making punk even more accessible as if it were just pop on the radio. It's a really great example of how the sounds are evolving and what artists are doing in order to get us to those places. In case you didn't really know how we got from punk music to alternative rock music, this is kind of how we get there. So you can use those as examples. Next, Cabaret Voltaire, 2x45. It's avant-garde. It's pre-electronica. Here's the thing. I know that Red Mecca, which is their album from 81, is considered like their big one. I did keep it. It's on my big list for 81. But I perceive that this is a little bit more cooked, truthfully. And the reason I say that is where they were doing heavy amounts of experimentation, like it was way more avant-garde in Red Mecca. 2x45 to me seems a little bit more focused, a little bit better edited. It's tighter. Their perspective is clearer. And I also think that they're pushing the boundaries a little bit of what will inevitably become electronica down the line. Specifically, the track Breathe Deep, it's definitely pre-electronica for sure, and definitely avant-garde for 1982. But interestingly enough, I think there are some hints here about what they call garage or two-step, which is an electronica movement that started in the late 90s and early 2000s that was based in the UK and in Europe. And it was post-house music and everything. So it was the next idea after house that eventually became garage and then two-step and then eventually dubstep, which is, what's happening in the 2010s. So the ideas that are permeating in Breathe Deep, it sounds kind of like that, where it's a little bit deep, it's a little bit dancey, it's a little bit dark. It's got a good beat and a good rhythm to it, but they're still obviously playing with a lot of ideas. I don't think that they really know exactly what they've found here, but I think they perceive that they found something really interesting and good that I believe will inspire electronica artists for years to come. So that one specific track, I would give that a listen. If you like the rest of it, go listen to the rest of it. But to me, that's just that one good example to call out. Next, Shaka Khan by Shaka Khan. It's contemporary R&B. It's Quiet Storm. It's a little jazzy. She's kind of hitting all the different bases when it comes to the R&B idea. She's obviously a precursor to Whitney Houston, which makes a lot of sense. She's deeply influential. I would challenge you to actually compare this up to disco, like from 79, if you want to dig into my big list and check out some of the Donna Summer that was going on that year. This is just so much further into that R&B space that is so great because she's not focusing so much on dance music or dancing to this, but it's still got really great rhythms to it. But at the same time, she's very clearly pushing some R&B boundaries, some R&B traditions in order to take it to different places. Specifically, the first track, Tearing It Up, I would say is a really great example of her pushing boundaries, but then Slow Dancin' that features Rick James. That to me, even more so, is just showing like where R&B is going in this moment and how aggressively she's trying to push boundaries and experiment with ideas in R&B. Again, compare that up to disco. This doesn't sound like disco at all. It sounds totally different and yet somehow still calls back to it. It's kind of genius. Shaka Khan, she's really great. We've only gotten started with her, I would say. There's certainly more from her. I know that there was stuff that came before this, but to me, this is really her officially kind of declaring her position in the pantheon of R&B greatness. So give that one a listen. Next, Dead Kennedys, Plastic Surgery Disasters. It's post-punk just like all of their albums have been. This is one of my favorite albums, I would say, of the decade. It's a triumph, period. I mean, I think on the essential list, I put 4 tracks in there for you to listen to. Honestly, it's just the tightest, most intense part of the record. If you listen to those tracks and you really like what they're doing, I would go back and just listen to the whole thing because the whole album is just genius. It's impeccably edited, which is interesting to say for a punk album, also considering how psychotic it is and its concepts. It's an incredibly well-edited album. I can't say enough about how much thought Dead Kennedys put into structuring the record, and telling the stories that they wanted to tell. It's amazing. It's a fantastic album. I love this album so much. It's so ridiculous. It's so anxiety inducing. It's so silly. It's so angry, but in the funniest, craziest way possible. It's like watching somebody have a psychotic break on the microphone. It's really awesome. And it's clear that wherever they were anxious during their album, Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables, for this album, they're just full-blown psychotic. It's really great. It's really awesome. The only sad thing about it is this album is so great, it really does feel like we're starting to end this genre, which, again, really sad because they're hitting such great heights here, but it also a little bit feels like a send-off. Like they've hit the top of the mountain on whatever it is that they were trying to achieve with this sound, with these ideas. We've done it officially. And now we're probably going to move on. Not to say that they're ready to move on necessarily, because I think that they have a lot of missives and a lot to complain about in this album. But I think it's just kind of is another signal that we're on the way out with this sound, which is, again, a shame. Another really good indicator that we're moving out with this sound is the next album, Fang, Landshark. It's slacker rock, it's alternative rock, it's thrash metal, it's pre-grunge. There's a ton going on here. And the reason I say that this album, the Landshark by Fang, is another indication that post-punk is ending is just how indifferent this band sounds when they're playing the music. They sound like they don't care. They sound like if you're playing Diamond Head while laying on the couch. Like, it's just the funniest thing you listen to. Like, their perspective on, I mean, just listen to the first track, you know, which I do have on my list here. The Money Will Roll Right In. Or Landshark, the one that comes right after that. Or Law and Order, the one that comes right after that. You know, I kept 4 tracks on my essential list. All of them are excellent examples of just how little they actually do care about getting famous or getting notoriety or whatever. Or they espouse that because they're providing a commentary on how punk music has become commercial and we don't actually really care about getting famous because our punk forebearers have become too focused on getting famous and making lots of money. So we don't even really care about that, which is interesting to me because it clearly shows how the counterculture ideas are evolving and moving. Honestly, I would just listen to the whole thing just because it's so great. The whole album is amazing. One thing I do want to call out about this album is I'm pretty sure that, as you can hear, it's a huge, huge, huge inspiration for Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. And I'm pretty sure that Kurt Cobain fought like tooth and nail in order to get this album to print, because it sounds like it wasn't necessarily well circulated when it was first released. So clearly there's a lot of inspiration there for him and thus the ushering in of the whole grunge movement. So give this one a listen because it's 1982 and we're already rejecting punk music as passé just based on this album, which is super aggressive, right? I think it's super interesting because I don't even think post-punk is moving out yet, let alone passé. But this album sort of forces you into a position of questioning whether or not the whole idea is passé at this point. It's really great stuff. Next, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, The Message. It's rap, period. I think we all kind of know that, right? Anybody that knows anything about the history of rap knows that this album and The Message, the song within the greater album, are critically important to the culture. And the thing I'll say, though, about this album is that it is highly experimentational, almost as if to say they came up with what they wanted to do like 10 minutes before they actually recorded the track every single time. I kept The Message. Obviously, it's a critically important track, which we'll talk about more here in a second, but I kept It's Nasty off of this album just as a really good example of how it sounds like what they decided was, I'm going to do my thing and then you jump in and do your thing. Okay, great, I'll do it. And then you jump in and do your thing. Okay, great, I got it. And like they didn't know what each other was going to do, but they just got on the mic and did it, which is super interesting to me, right? Because for Curtis Blow, that was honestly them just putting a microphone in a house party and just letting Curtis Blow do his thing in a structured and edited way so it made sense for a record. But in this, they're actually getting into the studio, trying to figure out how to create a rap record that is just strictly about rap, and there isn't the like callback back and forth. There isn't that homage to toasting and dance hall from reggae. Like they're just getting in the studio, getting on the mic and doing their thing. So to me, it seems like they didn't totally know what a rap record would be like. And so I think that they're trying to create some kind of rules and structure around it to give a pathway and give some directionality to future rap artists that are interested in putting out a rap record. This is the first, and so because of that, it's pretty messy, I would say. But it's messy in a really great way. Like, they just don't really seem to have a handle on exactly what they're doing, which is awesome. It's one of my favorite records from the year because I love rap and I love what at least this record provides to the culture. Because for anybody that isn't familiar with the message, the song, is that during this period of time, the message was such a no-nonsense view into what was going on in Black culture in the early 80s, specifically in New York. And I'd like to believe that it helped enable cultures outside of Black culture to get an understanding for what was going on in their lives in a way that perhaps they didn't have visibility on that before. And because of that, that's why it's a tremendously important track, an important record, is it really gives that viewpoint into what was going on at the time in a very clear-eyed sort of way. And obviously it still has the creative conventions of rap and music, but it's also still the first time that this wasn't just about where we're going to record a house party, everyone's having a good time, etc. There's an actual message behind it, like, hey, things aren't so great for us, and I don't know that you know that. Do you know the depths with which things aren't so great for us? Let's have a conversation about it, because I want you to know what's going on. And that commentary, while critically important in this medium, and I think has very minimally started to permeate other creative mediums, like movies and TV and stuff like that, this one was really important for the culture. And then again, also proliferating the struggles and the challenges that were being experienced as clearly as one could get while still making it music. And so if you haven't heard the message before, it's unfortunately at once a time capsule of what's happening in 1982 in Black culture, but also there's still a heck of a lot that's going on today that is relevant to this song too, which is a huge tragedy because we're 40 plus years later and some of this stuff is still a problem. Some of this stuff is still an issue. Some of these things are still a challenge. And so if you haven't given it a listen for a long time, or you haven't really listened to it very clearly or directly, or really paid attention to it, give it a listen just because it's vitally important to the culture and it's a huge milestone in rap, period. Next, Joe Jackson, Night and Day. Here's the thing. I still don't know what genre Joe Jackson is going for. I think you could define it as new wave a little bit maybe, but it's its own thing. Him and Elvis Costello and XTC, all these bands are just flying off and doing their own thing. And I don't totally understand how to define it. I've tried to look it up. There's no clear way to define it. But either way, I think that he's maximizing whatever this is. But at that same turn, kind of like with Dead Kennedys, I think that he's hitting a peak of creativity in this record that is signaling that whatever this is going to be over soon, which again is super sad. Like he's hit the top of the mountain and then kind of like a roller coaster, as soon as you hit the top, you're going down. Another World is a really particular call out for me. Steppin' Out is his hyper famous song that he did other than Is She Really Going Out With Him, which I think was in 1979. This is his other hyper famous song. If you haven't heard it for a while or you haven't heard it at all 4 tracks that I referenced, so Another World, Chinatown, that was that idea that I was talking about, right, of referencing Asia and like disconnecting, super weird. Check that one out. I don't understand it. It's a really great track. I don't understand the reference to China though, or Chinatown or anything in that respect. TV Age, another great one, and then Steppin' Out. All 4 tracks are really great. If you like the rest of what he's doing here, it all sounds like this in a good way, so check the rest of the album out if it's your vibe. For sure. Next, Men Without Hats, Rhythm of Youth, New Wave Synth Pop. They did the Safety Dance, in case you haven't heard of Men Without Hats without this context, or you've just heard Safety Dance and never put the pieces together on this. Unfortunately, this is another sign of synth pop starting to move its way out, because I think that this album as a whole hit its peak. Some people think that Safety Dance is a ludicrous, ridiculous, not interesting track for some reason. I think it's a little kitschy, but I also think that it's a fun idea. And the sounds that are being used and the synths are being used in a very particular way. The voice that he uses has that echo behind it, which is really quintessential 80s synth pop. I just think that they've really smoothed and refined out, the synth pop ideas over the last several years. And to me, this is one of those records that, again, they've kind of hit that peak. Like Antarctica is a really great track on here. Ideas for Walls is another tremendous track. And The Great Ones Remember, All great tracks. They're all on the essential playlist for you to listen to and enjoy. If you like the rest of it or you want to go back and listen to the Safety Dance, it's all up to you. Like I said, it's a tremendous record that unfortunately is giving that indication that we're starting to get a little sick of new wave synth pop. So it's sad, but there it is. Next, Michael Jackson's Thriller. Is this a gigantic surprise? Probably not. It's contemporary R&B. Did you know that? I'm sure you did know that. You probably know everything about this record, and if you don't, let me talk to you a little bit about how amazing it is, for a couple different reasons. One, I find this album to be similarly calculated as Off the Wall, but it's calculated in a really fun, entertaining way because, for example, let's just start with the album cover, right? It's Michael Jackson wearing that white suit, laying, just kind of lounging on the ground, brown background, black shirt, right? He looks chill on that cover. He looks a lot more chill than he did on Off the Wall, where he was kind of standing up. He's, got his tight tuxedo thing going on, and, he looks like he's ready to dance. In this one, he's chilling, right? He looks like he's about to put out an easy listening record with Phil Collins, right? And then even the lettering on the record itself, it's just in cursive, Michael Jackson, like he signs it if he, were signing an autograph, and then Thriller. And you look at the album cover and you look at the word Thriller and you go, knowing nothing about the record Thriller, like the track Thriller, which we've all heard before, I'm sure, it seems to make this weird juxtaposition of he's really chilled out, he's lounging, and then Thriller, as if to say, he doesn't seem thrilled on the record cover, right? He doesn't. He seems casual. He doesn't seem thrilled. He doesn't seem excited. And so it's really funny looking at this record cover and going, well, what about this is a thriller? I don't understand. And as you start to listen to the record itself, the first 2-3 tracks, well, first of all, Wanna Be Starting Something to me is, it's not a copy of, but it's in the same vein as Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, right? Like there's a little bit, it's the same kind of idea. It's just that, honestly, I think there's a little bit more black culture to it, right? I think that where previously Don't Stop Till You Get Enough was more disco-y, Wanna Be Starting Something was, honestly, it wasn't totally rap, but it was definitely like heavier R&B and less disco. And if you listen really carefully, which you probably already know, but I'm going to say it anyway, that it does reference Billie Jean, which, the character that he's created for the purposes of this record that obviously references things that happened to him in real life. So there was Wanna Be Starting Something, and after that, Baby Be Mine, which is, again, it kind of a little bit sounds like easy listening, soft rock, something like that. Really soft R&B at the very least. And then he does a track with Paul McCartney, which also sounds like soft rock, easy listening. And then boom, you're hit with Thriller. And you're like, what is this track? And then Beat It right after that with electric guitar by Eddie Van Halen. Like everything's crazy after that. Then like Billie Jean. And then, it kind of softens up with Human Nature, one of my favorite tracks. It's a like deep core memory for me, Human Nature, for some reason. My parents must have been listening to it a lot when I was a kid. PYT, and then, and then it just ends the album, right? There's one track after that almost nobody remembers. And so it's a really interesting album where he is taking you in this one direction that you think is totally expected. Like, oh yeah, Michael Jackson's just going to do another easy listening or like disco album or whatever. And then he just punches you right in the gut with Thriller, like Vincent Price is on it. You're like, what is this even? And here's the funny thing about Thriller, the track, is that he was giving clear signals about Thriller even back in 1980 when he was with the Jacksons still. And he did This Place Hotel. This Place Hotel, that track on Triumph, the Jacksons, is the precursor to Thriller, period. I think it's widely agreed upon that that's the case, but in case you've never heard This Place Hotel, go back and listen to that and you're like, oh yeah, it's like if Thriller and disco was merged together into one idea. But it's very obviously the precursor to Thriller, so it's not like Thriller was invented in a vacuum and he had a lightning bolt of inspiration all of a sudden. Like, no, there was clearly an evolution that led him and Quincy Jones to that moment. But either way, it's a tremendous album. Obviously, there's not a lot more you could say about it that hasn't already been said. One thing I will call out, though, is a fun fact about Baby Be Mine. For anybody that is concurrently a fan of Michael Jackson and also is very familiar with the soundtracks to the Sonic the Hedgehog video games, like the Sega games, Baby Be Mine's backtrack sounds almost exactly like Sonic the Hedgehog music, specifically Starlight Zone from Sonic the Hedgehog 1. It's really funny that you realize that clearly when they were making Sonic the Hedgehog several years later, I think like 1990, they were borrowing heavily from Michael Jackson conventions to a degree. And this isn't just made up stuff. Like, it's very obvious that the connection is there, is that for Sonic the Hedgehog 3, they wanted Michael Jackson to do the soundtrack for the game. And he actually made several tracks for them. But upon hearing the output of what was possible with the limitations of the synths that they could use for making the Sonic 3 soundtrack, he was so dissatisfied with the output that he kind of cut his ties with it, and they ended up having to go in different directions. But that connection does exist. It is there. So if you want to listen to Baby Be Mine and just ignore everything that he's singing and just listen to the background track and then go, yeah, you know, that kind of does sound like video game music a little bit from Sonic the Hedgehog. And then go listen to the Sonic the Hedgehog soundtrack, Starlight Zone specifically. It's not exactly the same, but there's a heavy amount of inspiration there. So fun fact. I'm giving you a little bit of something new maybe about Thriller that you hadn't heard before. Anyway, next, Missing Persons, Spring Session M. It's pop punk for sure. It's new wave, definitely. It's an amazing album. It's pre-alternative rock. It's pre-Madonna. It's pre-Cyndi Lauper by like a year. Missing Persons, they got out ahead of that sound before Madonna or Cyndi Lauper could get it out there, I think even a year later. Specifically, listen to Windows on Spring Session M. You'll listen to that and go, oh, wow. Like, is that Cyndi Lauper that's doing the singing for this track? And then she just happened to break out and do her own thing? No, it's a totally different person. It's a totally different idea. Not to say that it's important that Missing Persons did it first, but that just goes to show how experimental and interesting this album was, because Windows is just one example of some of the stuff that they do, because they go all over the place. There's a lot of pop punk in here. There's a lot of new wave going on for sure. And it gives a lot of indication of what Madonna and Cyndi Lauper in a way were going for, that some might argue that at least in the beginning, their origins were pop punk versus just straight pop, music that everybody knows and loves about both of those artists. So, as is always the case, their ideas came from somewhere else. And not to say that they were listening to Spring Session M or whatever, because I'm sure that they were deeply involved in just making their own albums at the time. But is it possible that they were all listening to the same things and got similar amounts of inspiration? Yes, that is exactly what this project is all about. So give that one track a listen. And if you like that one track and you want to listen to the rest of it, go listen to it. It's on the big list. But Missing Persons, Spring Session M, I love this album. It's one of my favorites for the year. It's so varied and so confident. I love it. Next, Prince, 1999. It's contemporary R&B, obviously, as always. It's also plus new wave. We have understood that, at least from his 79 album, Prince, that he does a lot of work merging new wave and R&B ideas together in order to create some highly experimental things. I think it's more experimental than Thriller. But at the same time, I also think it's a lot less well edited. I think that Thriller, the songs are tighter, they're shorter, the album is a lot more focused. 1999 has a couple tracks, at least in my opinion, that drag a little bit. Some of those tracks are like 7-8 minutes. Now, for an R&B or pop album, no. But the first 3 tracks on the album are hyper famous for him. 1999, Red Corvette, and Delirious are all hyper popular and significant tracks for Prince. He's still got that swagger that he always has. He's got those funk influences that he was experimenting with in 79 and bringing them forward to his distinctive flavor. We all know that Prince is a thoughtful consumer, and it's clearly displayed in this music. But as far as him editing himself down on some of these tracks, I think maybe he was getting a little too fixated on some of his sounds. And I honestly just don't think that he was thinking about how consumable it was, because he was just sort of relishing in how great it was, which I agree with. It was great, but does it drag a little bit? Yes. So I think 1999 is great, but, I think it could have used a lot more editing, which, it's a nitpick for sure. Next, the Psychedelic Furs, Forever Now. I would say we can officially define this as Paisley Underground, because this is kind of the Psychedelic Furs idea. It's their sound. I don't know if they necessarily created it, but they're definitely ushering in this idea. I also think that they're starting to go into a vein which I perceive to be like new wave Brit rock or something like that. I don't know exactly how to define it, but it's starting to veer into that direction, and I'll call it out as it starts to get a little bit more defined over the next year or two, because it will, and I'll keep calling it out. But here's the thing about this album, which I like so much. And the example that I'll call out specifically is Forever Now, the track in Forever Now, that the Psychedelic Furs did something super interesting, where last year in Talk Talk Talk, they, I would say, found their great sound that they had been pursuing for at least the last several years. And then for Forever Now, specifically on that track, it sounds like they've tossed away a lot of some of that greatness that they found in Talk 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 so that they could pursue other different varieties of greatness, which is amazing to see. I very rarely see things like this going on this project, right? I saw the only one that really readily comes to mind is Radiohead when they did OK Computer, and they really nailed the sort of neo-psychedelic rock, alternative rock idea, space rock, put all that together with OK Computer, and then they just like tossed it aside and pivoted to Kid A. I think like the very next year or the year afterward, and it was a totally different sound. It was basically indie electronica. And it just goes to show how many great ideas that they have. And so they're not particularly committed to any one idea in a way like Talking Heads, but in this case, much more extreme, where they said, yeah, we did this really great stuff in Talk, Talk, Talk. Now we're going to pivot and do some of these even more great things because as we've been talking about with the Psychedelic Furs for the last several years, they have been working so hard to distance themselves from being strictly, I think I even said, David Bowie on a sad day, which, you know, they're still like a 0.5% that. Like, I don't think they could possibly get away from that altogether, nor probably do they want to. But they've been so aggressively pursuing their creative inspiration that this is just where it's led them to in this moment. And so it's just amazing. If you go back and listen to the episodes, even from 79 all the way up until this moment, the story has been about the Psychedelic Furs evolving into this just tremendously amazing, highly creative band, which I'm sure everybody who's a fan of theirs already knows this. But for me, going on this journey fresh, it astounds me. They're just continuing to evolve so wonderfully, and I love it. So if you want a great example, Forever Now on Forever Now, it's in the essentials list. Give it a listen. If you like the rest of it, go listen to the rest of the album. It's all really great. I'm really starting to love them. It's really awesome. Next, Toto 4. It's soft rock. I would say at this point, we could officially, as I said in the music trends, soft rock is officially happening. It's officially on trend. Hall & Oates and Phil Collins brought us to this moment. The Cars brought us to this moment with Candy O from 79. The Police, in a little bit of a way, brought us to this moment, though they were more all over the place and more experimentational. The way that I know that soft rock is officially on trend is that this album has some degrees of variation, but there's not a lot of experimentation going on, and there's a lot of hits on this album. And so because of that, I think you can listen to most of the tracks on here. I think I listed out Rosanna, I Won't Hold You Back, It's a Feelin', Africa. All 4 of those are distinctly different sounds. They do distinctly different things, so it really shows you the breadth with which Toto was exploring the realm of soft rock and what it means or what it could be. It's also why they are a super famous band in their own right. You know, Toto's been around for a really long time and they do a really good job, and this one is in a way a magnum opus for them, I think, just because of how many different ways they approach the soft rock ideas. And, you know, there's a little bit of synth in there. Just there's a lot of good stuff in here. But one thing I do want to honor about it is just how firmly and confidently they're planting themselves in this soft rock zone, as if to create some kind of a handhold for anybody else that wants to enter into soft rock. They're giving them, kind of like with Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, they're giving them a further roadmap where perhaps Hall & Oates and Phil Collins were a little bit more committed to their own ideas and their own sounds. And the Cars similarly. I think Toto is playing with enough ideas that are consumable to a lot of other artists to inspire them to do more of this stuff. So whether or not you like soft rock, I mean, maybe this is a good thing or bad thing for you. I personally don't love soft rock. It's not one of my favorite genres, but they're clearly sending out a lot of signals to aspiring artists like, here's, you could do this, you could play with that idea, you could go in this direction. So for that, I love how much inspiration they're proliferating. So good job. Next, I promised we would get here, Tracy Thorn, A Distant Shore, Twee Pop. It's haunting. It's beautiful. It's introspective. It's a little introverted. It's the precursor to a lot of different stuff. I mean, you listen to this album. You could even listen to the first track, the first couple tracks, Small Town Girl, Simply Couldn't Care. Either one, both of them. Listen to the whole album. I think the whole album is amazing. I perceive that she's created this thing, whatever it is. I'm sure that it's referencing something earlier that came before 79 that, you know, I have no frame of reference of. But this sound right here, right now, it's like Diamond Head. You listen to this and you go, this is the beginning of this idea, which, you know, I'm sure that people who grew up in the 90s are familiar with Everything But the Girl, at least like their one track that they did that everybody knows. And there's still a long runway to get to that moment, for sure, because Tracy Thorn eventually, like I said, gets into Marine Girls, and then she eventually gets into Everything But the Girl, and she sits there for like 10 years. And then, you know, I know a lot about Tracy Thorn because she's fantastic. But this is a deeply, deeply, deeply influential album, A Distant Shore. And it influenced untold amounts of female singer-songwriters and other twee pop in the mid-'80s, late 80s, early mid-'90s, late 90s. I mean, it kind of keeps going and going. I also would argue that these are some of the precursors to shoegaze, which, if anybody doesn't know about what shoegaze is, it's literally you're imagining a band on stage. You have the lead guitarist and the singer standing up there, and they're hunched over playing their guitar very carefully and very quietly, and they're singing very quietly and very intensely into their microphone. And while they're doing that, they're gazing down at their shoes because there's sort of a introverted introspection there going on, right? So shoegaze. I think that there's a little bit of that. I think this is a little bit more accessible than shoegaze is. I don't know. This album, and many like it for Tracy Thorn, elicits a lot of sort of mental images in my mind that are all very kind of pleasant, very pleasing. I don't know. I just love this album. It's really fantastic. Give the first couple tracks a listen that I referenced in the Essential list, and then move on or keep listening. Either way. Don't let my bias impact you, but I love this album. Next, Venom, black metal. It's black metal, obviously, right? They invented it. They literally defined what it was by calling the album and the track on the album black metal. They sing about it being black metal. They also, I think, to a certain degree, influenced or birthed speed metal, which I think we're only a year or two away with Metallica, which I think people consider to be the actual creators of speed metal. But at least for black metal's case and everything that shot off of that, in Scandinavia with doom metal and all that other stuff, they literally invented it. Venom literally invented it. They called it, they defined it, it's theirs. This to me is a full-blown experimentation of punk and metal, where previously with Diamond Head, I think that they were doing a little bit of a 70s thing, and then there was a tiny bit of punk stuff, and there was metal, and they created the sort of new wave of heavy metal. This is just the sludgiest punk you can think of with the hardest metal you can think of, and putting it together and making black metal. I put Black Metal, the song, on my Essentials just so you could listen to it and hear and go, oh yeah, this is everything that I've ever known, with the exception of like the roaring and the guttural, cries of black metal and doom metal that we know from later years, even today. This was the precursor to all that, because I don't think that they exactly knew altogether what this would become, but they very clearly said, we're going in this direction. If you're really into this kind of deep, dark, sludgy, aggressive music, then this is for you. So as a result, it's extremely polarizing. Maybe you'll listen to black metal and hate it because you're not into it. I personally do not like black metal or doom metal. It's not my thing. It never has been my thing. But every time a really well-regarded album comes out every single year, I will give it a chance. I'll listen to a track or two and just go, nope, it's more of the same. So the reason I don't like it is because it eventually levels off, and I perceive it doesn't go anywhere meaningful. And I do acknowledge that it is deeply part of, rooted in Scandinavian culture, and it's become just part of daily life, and I get that, but it's never been for me. But it is also really great to honor where it came from, so give this track a listen for a little bit of a history lesson. Or if you're super into black metal, go listen to it, because this is the beginning of everything. Have a party. Next, The Waitresses, Wasn't Tomorrow Wonderful? It's new wave punk. It's pop punk. This is totally a B-52s acolyte, which, since I love the B-52s, this is right up my alley. It's a little bit more accessible than the B-52s were, so it's a little bit more poppy than that, which I think is why we call it pop punk in this case. But the influences are just so clear. I would actually challenge you to listen to all the different kinds of influences that they have other than the B-52s, which I think is the obvious one. This is a great pivot to me off of the Go-Go's, which they started something, and I think that the Waitresses are taking it into even better directions, more palpable, more consumable. I'd like to believe that record producers for pop music are starting to hear some of this stuff and go, yeah, I can turn this into something that makes me money. It's great. No Guilt, Wise Up, Quit, 3 great tracks from this record that well articulate exactly what we're talking about here as far as how consumable it is. Is it new wave punk? Still, yes, technically, but we're very clearly evolving out of just strict new wave punk and moving into this pop punk idea that will continue to permeate into other varieties of pop music as we go along, right? Because as soon as Madonna and Cyndi Lauper shows up, we're just clearing the whole table off and we're starting all over again with whatever they're doing. So until we get to that moment, there's still a little bit of playing around with oh, do we sound like this? Do we try and sound like that? Do we play with this? So that there's still a little bit of uncertainty and experimentation before some guardrails are officially drilled into the ground. We're not there yet. But this one's a great listen. Give it a listen. Next, X, Under the Big Black Sun. It's alternative rock. It's post-punk a little bit. I would honestly challenge you to listen to this. The couple tracks that I put on here, The Hungry Wolf and Motel Room in My Bed, listen to how much punk has softened at this point. It's still punk. You can kind of hear it in there. It's a little bit in the background. There's some of those conventions that are still in there. Some of those ideas are starting to just drop off and fall away in favor of some of this other stuff that sounds a lot softer. It's also a B-52's evolution, but it's a little bit more punk than they were. It's really excellent. It's really accessible. X has a really long history in the 80s, so this is kind of just the beginning of them. They're going to continue to evolve a lot more than this, but this one is just a really great example of how some of those older ideas of traditional punk and maybe even post-punk and new wave punk are starting to slough off in favor of what alternative rock will inevitably become. This is a transformative album for sure of the genres. Finally, Yellow Man, Mr. Yellow Man. This is new generation reggae. This is clearly the future of reggae and not dub, right? Because I think that we've done a lot of work on dub and haven't really focused too much on what the new generation of reggae is. Yellow Man in this case is really interesting because this is the very, very beginning of him. And anybody that's a reggae enthusiast knows how important and impactful Yellow Man was to the genre, to the industry. He's going to be going for a very long time. I've kept a lot of Yellow Man albums for sure. And the great thing about this early moment for him, since he's still getting his foothold, much like every beginning mega artist that turns into something tremendous, their first outings, the first couple outings, they've got a foot planted in what was, and they're starting to only play with and introduce some new ideas, and they're not going full bore into their new ideas just yet, right? Because they're trying to accumulate their following of traditionalist listeners and some younger reggae listeners that are interested in hearing something new that evolves a little bit more. It's a little bit fresh. It's a little bit punchier. There's a much more updated rhythm than the traditional ideas. Think about your Bob Marleys and stuff. That's a little bit more traditional. There's a lot of life to it. And this is also to say that Yellow Man coming out of this record sounds like he has a lot of potential, but there's still a lot more for him to do. Natty Sat Upon the Rock, Lost Me Love, both of those are really great examples of him having one foot planted in the past and one foot planted in the future, coming across as a little bit fresh, but also honoring what came before. So it's really great stuff. Give that a listen. Finally, J-Pop Check-In. Hey, there isn't one this year. I think at this point, you've got enough grounding that we're good going forward. I think that once we have something to put into our essential albums, since Taiko Unuki was in our essentials last year, and I've introduced you to loudness and the J-rock sound. So once we do get some of those albums that are essential, I'll definitely be putting them in the list accordingly. But at this point, I think we can kind of take the training wheels off when it comes to J-pop. But for K-pop, I will kind of go back and do the same thing around a K-pop check-in when things aren't exactly there yet, but give you a little bit of a flavor for it. But then, that'll kick up a lot faster, I think. K-pop will go from being, let's check in to, oh yeah, this is hitting in like a year or two. So we'll get there, but that won't be until we're in the 90s. Okay, let's talk about our conspicuous absences before we close out here. Specifically, A Flock of Seagulls, A Flock of Seagulls. Honestly, this to me, again, is another sign that new wave synth pop is on the way out. Like, I get that I Ran is on that album. It's the first track of the first album. I just honestly think that A Flock of Seagulls, while good at new wave synth pop, is coming in a little late to the trend. And so because of that, I just don't think that they're treading anything new or different or interesting. I think that the album, I guess, itself is a little tight and focused. But again, I think that we're getting into sort of the later edge of new wave synth pop being in. And I think that we're going soon to be moving into it moving out. Like, it's not going to be passe for a while. I think there's still a lot of A Flock of Seagulls fans out there, right? But I definitely think that they're hitting this as we're sort of cresting and starting to go down a little bit. So it's a lot less interesting. There's not as much experimentation as perhaps prior years. And with some of the synth pop that we've kept in our essential albums, that they're still pushing envelopes, I don't think A Flock of Seagulls is necessarily doing that too much. Next, Bruce Springsteen, Nebraska. This might be a little bit painful for some people. It's still on my big list if you really want to check it out. The thing about this album, because I love Bruce, is that this sounds very concept album-y to me, which is not a bad thing. It's just I don't really need it in my life too much. I will honor the fact that he's doing some really interesting lo-fi stuff, which I think is a signal to the eventual gigantic wave of lo-fi that's going to come out over the next several years in the 90s. So Bruce being forward thinking about that stuff, it's no secret, right? I think in 79 and 80, there was a lot of artists that wanted to sound like Bruce, and he's clearly still the boss. He's even the boss today in 2024. Nobody's going to argue with that. But this, for me, I didn't really need it in my life, but it's still good, and I totally honor that it's good. Dexy's Midnight Runners, 2 Rye Eye. The thing is, this is a really good album, but it's really, really unfocused, and the perspective on it is really hard to gauge. There's a lot going on here. There's a little bit of ska. There's a little bit of Celtic traditions. There's some new wave. There's a little bit of punk. Like, it's all over the place, and all of it's pretty darn good. It's just the perspective gets lost immediately. Like, I have no idea what they were going for in this album, and it's unfocused in that regard. But despite all of that, it's still a fun listen. And I think they do a really great job with all the songs that they put together. It's just, I didn't really track the perspective. And so it's why it's on my conspicuous absences versus it's just on my list and we don't even really have to talk about it. Because I did want to honor the fact that it is a great album. It's just the perspective is a little tough to track. Duran Duran and Rio is next. This also might be pretty painful considering that at the very least, the cover art for this is quintessential 80s pop art style. And, the idea that they had with Rio as a character is super fun. Duran Duran is obviously like extraordinarily influential with, I would say, late stage new wave synth pop. So it's not like it's not a good album. The honest to goodness problem that I have with this album is that it is too long. It is too long. The tracks are too long. They sit on these ideas for way too long. It's like 40% longer than it needs to be on every single track, and as a result, the whole record. Rio, as a really great example, by minute 2, you're like, yeah, okay, I get it. This is fun. This is good. I'm grooving. By minute 3, you're like, okay, sure, fine. By minute 4, you're like, is this song still happening? By minute 5, you're like, what are they doing? Get off of this song and get on to the next one. And it keeps being that way. Like all their tracks are 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 4 minutes. And because of that, it tells me that they were reveling in their ideas a little bit too much and they weren't truncating and tightening some of this stuff down so that it's highly focused and it's just highly intentional. And it also says to me that there's a tinge of lack of confidence in what they were putting out there, that they felt like they needed to sit on these tracks and sit on these rhythms for a little bit longer than they needed to, because there just wasn't enough ideas that they were going to generate in the void that was left by them being a little bit more focused and edited, which is unfortunate because Rio is a really great fundamental album for new wave synth pop. But I just think that it needed to be tighter and more confident, I think. Next, Lionel Richie. Honestly, I just think that there was a lot better contemporary R&B that came out this year. I love him. I love the Commodores, but I think that he needs to gather a little bit more of his own perspective before I'm excited about putting one of his albums in the essential albums. I mean, he's starting out a little bit, on his own right here. And so I think he is still trying to find his footing. I'm sure he'll get there. But for right now, I think he just kind of sounds like a lot of different people and I'm missing his perspective. So conspicuous absence. Finally, Patrice Rushen, Straight from the Heart. Honestly, this is just post-disco R&B, but the reason that I'm calling it out is that this album led to a lot of background tracks for a lot of famous rap that comes later. So a lot of rappers borrowed, and a lot of DJs borrow the breaks from a lot of her songs, particularly on this album. Kind of like Sister Sledge from 1979. Wasn't necessarily conspicuous absence because it was deeply in disco, but this is post-disco contemporary R&B. It's a really important, influential album to the rap culture just because of how frequently it's referenced. But as an album, again, it's a little long. It's not very well edited. It's not very well focused. I think that Chaka Khan annihilates her, as far as like which one I'm going to keep between the two of them, because Chaka Khan is far more ambitious than Patrice was in this case. So if she does greater, better stuff that's more focused later down the line, I'll absolutely give it its day in the sun. But this one for me, it's highly influential and referential. But other than that, it's absent. Having said that, all of this stuff is just my opinion. Some of it I get right, some of it I get wrong. I think in 1980, I had mentioned that Bon Scott was doing the vocals for Back in Black, and that wasn't correct. It was Brian Johnson, right? So I got that wrong. There's plenty of stuff I'm going to get wrong. And also, all of my opinions, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. I don't know. It's all subjective. But I want to hear from you all. What did you agree with? What did I disagree with? What did I miss? I'm sure I missed something in 82. I missed something every year. I mean, there's plenty of stuff that I'm not even giving the time of day. So I'm sure that I'm missing something fundamental. And then let's be honest, as we go along here in these years, there's going to be even more great stuff. The likelihood I'm going to be missing something or having an off-kilter opinion is pretty good. So call it out. Draw my attention to something that I might have missed. But at the same time, I want to know what you're learning, because I hope that you're learning something listening to some of this stuff and also hearing what I have to say about it. And I want to hear about all this stuff you're learning. Send me DMs, post comments. I'm excited to hear about all of it. But in the meantime, don't forget to check out our essential playlist for this year. Again, it's not going to be the full albums this time, just all the tracks that I've been referencing in my essential albums. So it's a lot shorter. It's like 3 hours. You could totally consume it in not too much time before the next episode. But feel free to check out my big list too, right? That's got all the rest of the albums for all these essentials, and then everything else that I kept but I didn't find to be essential. Also, my conspicuous absences are on that list. Both are linked in the description for this episode, so go check them out, please. Also, please join us again. If you're interested in continuing on this journey, things are going to continue to get busier and busier and busier, and I'm going to have to talk faster and faster and faster, so I'm not spending 3 hours talking about how great 1987 is. So come watch me struggle to really, make some Sophie's choices about some of these essential albums and my conspicuous absences. It's going to entertain me, and hopefully you'll enjoy it too. Don't forget to rate us and comment in Spotify or wherever it is that you're listening to this. Don't forget to check us out on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod. Come check us out. Come send us your hate messages. Come follow us. Come send us your love. Do whatever you need to do. I'm excited for you to join this community that we're building together. Don't forget to subscribe in case you forget for some reason that we put these episodes out every Tuesday, so you don't forget. And make sure to tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell your pets, tell your neighbors, tell whoever you want to tell. Because at the end of the day, we are trying to create a community here around some of this music and getting people to, engage with music that they've never really engaged with before, or think about music in ways that they didn't before because of reasons that they found it was inaccessible or they couldn't connect the dots. Or they honestly were just averse to the idea of some of this music, or maybe somebody put it in their head that this music wasn't very good, so they didn't give it any attention. But at the end of the day, hey, don't forget, all of this stuff isn't scary. It's just music, right? Thanks for listening.